evening, namaste, adab, namaskara, kem cho. I would feel the pressure of any such public talk, especially because I'm opening the talk. I have a bigger reason because I'm going to talk about history and culture. So with that, an honest show of hands, I can't see enough of you, but still, how many of you like history? Honest show of hands. I'm very happy to see these many hands. How many of you despise history? I can't see your faces, you can be honest. At least I can see few hands. The talk is for you all, right? And it's not to convert you. It's not about you appreciating history after these 15 minutes. It's to make you a part of it, yes? And to tell you that history is about us, or rather convince you that history is about us if we partake, and we would take it much further than just our textbooks and our presentations. And hence, I think what I'm here to sort of provoke is a necessary framework or a methodology or an approach, community engagement for cultural preservation. I'm sort of going to break this up for your better understanding through the kind of initiatives that we do at a collective called Curating for Culture. On that note, I must start with the community of Curating for Culture. So any of the work that you're going to see after this point is not mine alone. I take no sole credit of it. It is a number of practitioners, organizations, patrons, even online mentors, supporters, participants from across the globe who have made these frameworks and these approaches possible. They have believed in us, they have worked with us, we have fought, we have appreciated each other, and that's what makes Curating for Culture. Now coming to what I mean by cultural preservation, one, you could say I'm being strategic and not using the word history. You will understand why. History and heritage as a larger umbrella has been classified into different forms. Many of you might know we look at built heritage or the monuments or the structures which are right next to us. We also look at natural landscapes as heritage. We also have the intangible, which is the folklore, the rituals, the traditions, classified as intangible heritage. And then there are, of course, craft practices, which is a blend of, or cultural practices, which is a blend of the tangible and the intangible. And the most important and perhaps lesser known category is the documentary heritage, old photographs, memorabilia, journals, letters, documents, and whatnot, right? All of them together form that umbrella which sort of starts defining what is a cultural narrative. They start telling you the stories, and hence preservation needs to be seen as a very holistic approach or an initiative. But, the big but of our lives currently, more so than ever before, a much needed question: who does history belong to? At the space we are erasing history, left, right, and center, we might really not be left with a lot that belongs to us, that we connect with. And this question has been coming up again and again when you see so much of contestation across India, but also across other countries and other regions, taking down of history, taking down of heritage, erasing it, rewriting it, and of course marginalization that has been happening in history for many years. Now, before I bring in the framework which I am sort of talking about, one has to sort of look back at the processes that have already existed. So I'm not really saying over here that what we're talking about is rocket science. Heritage practices exist of many kinds, preservation and conservation practices, adaptive reuse, restoration, and they all go through many of these steps, processes. They might be in this linear order, they need not be, but I think what I'm trying to show over here is there's a spectrum, right? So all the way from identifying what is important to somebody, to a community, or to a landscape, or to a city, it goes all the way into assessing its condition. It almost becomes very living, like a doctor would do when they have to take care of us, right? And it comes down to the level of policies, legislation. So heritage and history or preservation are no more fields which are by the sideline. They are as much a part of what we think is our everyday lives. As much of politics is important, perhaps, in the newspapers and the vote bank, for the vote banks, it is important for what happens to our history. And in this existing process scenario, one is trying to say that there needs to be a much stronger component or an understanding of community engagement. And one of the slippery slopes has been to sort of bring in community, work with them, in a sort of an extractive way. I am sort of being very provocative here, where we work with them, we get to know things from them, we get information, we decide which stage sort of we would like to collaborate or co-work, whereas I think what we are pushing for or insisting here is that they become co-authors of the work that we're doing. This would increase the custodianship, this would increase the belongingness, and hopefully then any kind of erasure or even change of history would be much more consensual. There are two parts to this approach from where we see it. I'm not saying these are the only ways to go about it. I'm just showing you the ways we have gone about engaging communities into cultural preservation project. One important methodology for us has been archiving. Archiving, very simply put, is a science of preserving, taking care of documents, old memorabilia, objects, records. They are organized, well kept, conserved, preserved, and made available for future scholarship and research. Right? Earlier, as I was mentioning, the documentary heritage. But of course, it's beyond documents now. Objects are also a part of it. I'm now taking you through three kinds of ways or areas in which we have practiced archiving. One is cultural practices and narratives, right? This is particularly to do with working in regional centers or historic towns. So we have worked with Hampi, Mudbidri, Gulbarga, Udupi. This is to sort of understand how regional narratives or histories sort of play out in understanding and archiving the cultural practices of that place. It's beyond just the built structure. It's beyond just the museum. It is what people are living every day. So a good example over here is the images which you see at the bottom, the three images. This is from Gulbarga, where we found there were local historians and artists who have been constantly in their own way. And this is something that seems to be missing when you go and look for in the Museum of Gulbarga. Similarly, practiced and lived histories. So when you think of history post-independence, especially, but also a little before independence, a lot of people have made groundbreaking changes, brought about groundbreaking changes or significant practices in areas of science, architecture, design, philosophy, and whatnot. That part of Indian history has been the weakest when you look up, right? We've been so busy studying the West. And for that, it's been very important to record, trace the journeys of such pioneering practitioners or their offices through different methods. So what you see here is oral history recording, as well as research and mapping of different forms of practices and their stories. The third component, and the most important component, is where I'm connecting it back to those of you who said you don't like history. History goes down, if we want it to, history and its validation or its importance goes down to the microscopic level of the everyday of us, right? So it's not to say that history only is important after a certain number of years or only after you become somebody. Everyday history or the microscopic or the micro narrative also becomes important, and that's where personal and family history start playing a role. So what you see on the left, the images are actually projects of people trying to build personal archiving projects or family archiving projects from various parts of the country. So we started these practices 3 years ago, and I'm very glad to say 4 years ago, we have now worked with over 50 such archiving projects from across India and South Asia. And you would be surprised that there are so many families and communities who are interested in preserving their lineage and their history, which would become important to future generations. The second method that we have been sort of working with is curatorial, is to curate. Right? And over here, not necessarily curate the way you understand curation of art, but over here, the act of curation is to bring communities together. So earlier, we were trying to care for history or care for communities, and here we want to bring them together. We want an exchange. We want to facilitate that exchange because different communities would have a different skill set, different knowledge base, different literacy. And then when they put together in the same room or the same space, there is power dynamics, there is indifference, there is difficulty in the environment. How do you make that as a facilitator, as a curator, easier on everybody? So one is, of course, exhibitions or showcases, which we all know of, but they're very distant. We would find more engaging ways in terms of storytelling, workshops, performances, and more live activities. Now I'm just mirroring the 3 types of practices or areas which I talked about earlier, and showing you from archiving to curation how we have been able to take a leap or maybe make a dent. Well, when we think about cultural practices and narratives, one of the other areas where we have worked is Hampi, Anegundi. And from building the physical archive to moving on to collecting stories of or narratives of indigenous communities, we became much more clearer that what we need are platforms which are more fluid, where information sort of transpires into directions, allows you to navigate an archive or any information with more freedom. It's more unilateral in that sense. It's directionless. You can connect one story to another. You should be able to, as a reader, interpret and put in more information. Similarly, when I think about practiced and lived histories, these are somebody's life memoirs. So it has been very important to, of course, bring out publications, but then what does that publication aim to do? What's the philosophy? What's the value set? Is it challenging the conventional notions? That's what Biome Diaries did to what architectural monographs could be in the country. They became small. They became very accessible, unlike the big monographs which are very hard to acquire or access. On the other hand, oral histories of women architects turned into a digital archive. We wanted to push the boundary to understand how do you search an oral history. Oral histories are very expansive records, somebody talking for 10, 20 hours about their life. How would a researcher access that information? So what kind of a searchable database would you create? And again, coming to the personal and the family histories, we would all have, until now, I'm sure you would have all had a question, why should I care about the other person's personal history? And for us, the same question was important. And hence, more engaging forms of public dissemination, taking the exhibition a bit beyond where the audience engages to answer these questions by themselves was very important. So the images, the 2 images over here on the left, basically, they are from an exhibition which we did in Delhi. You see that it's a public records room. It's an imitation of a public records room. And in those 20 boxes, there were 20 different histories from across South Asia. And it was very interesting to see different kinds of audiences hesitate, open a story, not open it, handle it with care, ask questions about it, try to make connections with their lives and respond back to us. And we were very happy to see after a point it bustling with people to know that people are interested in history if you serve it right. So, summarizing it, from archiving to curation, right? What does it mean? What does it do? So one important thing, at least with this project, I feel, it starts building relationships. Because while we kept asking question for this project was, why are the women architects' histories missing in the post-independence architectural history or the narrative? And we eventually found that women to women, they hardly were talking, right? So those histories were not even known within themselves. Similarly, it also allows us to look at personal to collective. So when we look at Patni Archives, which has grown in the span of last 3 to 4 years, this was one of the projects which we incubated in the Constructing Personal Archives program in 2020. And in 2023, we had an open house. So the last image on this side is the community or the collective coming together to play treasure hunt at the exhibition. We can connect, and we can use history to sort of connect and belong. So you might ask me, what is it really relying on if you were to start practicing it with your communities, right? It begins with the logic of care, whether it is care for archives, histories, care for human beings as independent or individuals, but also care for collectives. And what it has done for us, most importantly, has expanded the understanding of the word community. We've started seeing it beyond the binary of urban and rural. Even an RWA is a community, even the area which I'm living, Vidyaranyapura is very much a community to me, and so could Mahe be a community to you. Now, how do you want to connect that community and see its narrative play out over the years is the vision with which you build a practice. Very important, as I said earlier also, people feel seen and represented. And I think it is mattering a lot more in today's age. That's what Reels and TikTok seem to show us. Everybody wants to be seen. And there's nothing wrong about it. Everybody has something to show or be about their talent or about their story. So why should history sideline anybody? And you become a part of it. And most importantly, it has made us much more conscious about content access, whether it's by working through languages, working with different languages, but working with making language more accessible, or working with platforms and technology. So this is to say we are not looking at historical projects or preservation as something that holds us back in time. We are more than happy to go ahead in time, take technology along with it, so that history becomes more and more relevant. This can get somewhere it becomes a pretty picture and you could lose the focus. What do I mean by this? One very important role when you're working with diverse communities is to ensure that you avoid any kind of appropriation. Simpler words, you don't tell somebody else's story through your lens, which benefits you. It's their story. And you be that unbiased as much possible author or a representative of that work. And that is why the co-authoring becomes very important. Where we don't presume, we don't draw the boundaries, we don't go with that preset notion, yehi karna hai, itna hi hoga, aapko karna padega. No, nobody over here plays power dynamics. And of course, as I said, we also slip the slope. There's always a way to track it back. There's always a way to correct when you start seeing these as more living projects. And then the most important thing I think perhaps has been to not worry about outputs and targets. Now, why I'm smiling at this is we're trying to defy the world outside, which is running at the pace of a clock. Kitne ghanton mein kitna paisa banega. And here we are saying we might experiment, we might fail. We're trying to understand the people. People are trying to understand the information that's been given to them because it's process-based. And still, everybody's got to earn their bread and butter, right? Even different community members, so do the curators, so do the archivists. How do you create that balance? At the end of it, I think what we have realized in the idea of building such ethics, there are many more, I'm just talking about a few, is that these projects do become life for us, and they have become life for many other. Even though they are making very small dent or a change, we are now happy to say that we are seeing that culture can also bring change. And hopefully if this grows, because this is very microscopic what I'm talking about, even though it sounds very large scale or something very fancy. It's very microscopic, the movement that we are able to bring with these kind of projects. But we hope it's like cellular process. If more of these cells and more of these microscopic projects and histories start to get preserved, hopefully we'll see lesser of erasure and more of connectedness in our cultural narratives. Thank you so much for listening to me patiently.